up, everybody? My name is Paper Pauper Player, and today we're going to be unboxing Red. Literally, like, just Red. We're gonna be unboxing, technically, 2 Red decks. I'm gonna be showcasing both Traditional Burn and Kuldotha Red. 2 Red decks that have almost identical deck lists, but play completely differently. If you're interested in either of these decks, both lists are gonna be down in the description below, and while you're down there, press the subscribe button. Let me know that you're enjoying the content, and in the next couple weeks, we're gonna be uploading more episodes of Paper Pauper Playing, a series where my friend and I play Paper Pauper. We've uploaded a couple now, and if you want to see either Burn or Kuldotha Red in an episode, leave it in the comments down below. As per usual, we'll be saving our cards in our Dragon Shield matte sleeves and keeping our cards in our Ultimate Guard Boulder deck box. It's packing peanut time! So I know this sounds stupid, but I wanted to wear a red shirt for this red video, and this is the only red shirt I own. It's Pizza Planet from Toy Story. So here's how this deck tech is going to go. I'm going to go over the full 75 card list for Traditional Burn, and then at the end of that, I'm going to then go over the cards that you need to swap out to turn the deck into Kuldotha Red. There's no tape on this side. Okay. Ooh, it's been a while since we've gotten a new Card Kingdom token. Look at this Angel token. That's kind of sick. So we're gonna kick this deck off with a red deck staple across all formats, Monastery's Swiftspear, which is a 1/2 creature that costs 1 red mana, has haste and prowess. Haste means that it can attack on the turn that it comes out, and prowess means that whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. Because you play it on turn 1, attack for 1 damage, on turn 2, you lightning bolt for 3 damage, and then you can attack for 2 because Monastery's Swiftspear gets the prowess trigger, which gives it the +1/+1, making it a 2/3. And then on your 3rd turn, you cast a couple more bolts, and then Monastery's Swiftspear swinging in for 3 damage. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So next up, we have 4 copies of Thermal Alchemist, which is a 0/3 creature that costs 2 mana, a red and colorless. It has Defender, meaning that it can't attack, but it doesn't matter because it has 0 power. But you could tap Thermal Alchemist to deal 1 damage to each opponent, and whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you can untap Thermal Alchemist. Thermal Alchemist is fantastic in this deck because if you drop him turn 2, then on turn 3, you could tap him to deal 1 damage to your opponent. You could play a lightning bolt, which does 3 damage to your opponent, and because you cast instant sorcery, you can untap him, and then you could tap him again to deal another 1 damage, totaling in 5 damage. And then because it's your 3rd turn and you're playing Burn and you have a bunch of 1 mana burn spells, you could probably play a 2nd lightning bolt, deal another 3 damage to your opponent, untap Thermal Alchemist, tap him again for another 1 damage, and the damage just keeps stacking. In a perfect hand of 3 lightning bolts, a Monastery's Swiftspear, and a Thermal Alchemist, and assuming you get to 3 lands on your 3rd turn, you'll deal 1 damage on turns 1 and 2 with Monastery's Swiftspear being 2 damage. You'll deal a total of 9 damage with your 3 lightning bolts on turn 3. Between all those lightning bolts, you've been able to tap and untap Thermal Alchemist for another 3 damage, which makes 12. And because of Monastery's Swiftspear's prowess ability, Monastery's Swiftspear on turn 3 will be a 4/5 because you casted 3 lightning bolts. So then you could attack with Monastery's Swiftspear for 4 damage. So between all 3 turns, if your opponent wasn't able to drop a blocker or whatever, you have been able to deal a total of 18 damage by turn 3. So that's actually going to wrap it up for the creatures in this deck, and now we're just going to talk about all the burn spells because they're all pretty much exactly the same. Starting off with 4 copies of Lightning Bolt, 1 red mana instant that deals 3 damage to target creature or player. You can target a creature or player and you can deal 3 damage to them. And then we have 4 copies of Lava Spike, which is a 1 red mana sorcery. Lava Spike deals 3 damage to target player, so you could spend 1 red mana and deal 3 damage to target player. Next up, we have Skewer the Critics, which is a 3 mana sorcery, a red and 2 colorless. Skewer the Critics deals 3 damage to any target, but also has Spectacle for 1 red mana, which means you can cast a spell for its spectacle cost rather than its mana cost if an opponent lost life this turn. So as long as you're able to either Lightning Bolt or Lava Spike your opponent before casting Skewer the Critics, or you could also tap Thermal Alchemist to deal 1 damage to your opponent, Skewer the Critics will then cost 1 red mana just like the rest of our Lightning Bolts. So we have 4 copies of that. So next up we have 4 copies of Chain Lightning, which is a 1 red mana sorcery. Chain Lightning deals 3 damage to any target, then that player or that permanent's controller may pay 2 red mana. If that player does, they may copy the spell and may choose a new target for that copy. So Chain Lightning is pretty interesting because if you have a lot of red mana and your opponent also has a lot of red mana, and you cast Chain Lightning and target them for the 3 damage, they can then pay 2 red mana to then basically Chain Lightning you, and you can theoretically do this forever if you guys have infinite red mana, but 99% of the time that's not the case and that doesn't happen, so it's basically just another Lightning Bolt. And then next up we have 4 copies of Rift Bolt, which is a 3 mana sorcery, a red and 2 colorless. Rift Bolt deals 3 damage to target creature or player, and it has Suspend 1 for 1 red mana. So the way Suspend works is that instead of casting this card from your hand, you can pay the Suspend cost to put it into exile with a time counter on it, and that time counter is whatever the number is after the Suspend. So for example, Rift Bolt only has Suspend 1, so it's only 1 time counter, but other cards may have like Suspend 3, so you put 3 time counters on it, but anyways. So basically how this works is on turn 1, instead of paying the 3 mana for Rift Bolt, you could pay the 1 mana Suspend cost. This will go into exile with a time counter on it, and then on your upkeep on your next turn, you'll remove a time counter, and because Rift Bolt no longer has any time counters, it will now cast for free. Essentially, it's a lightning bolt that you could pay 1 red mana to deal 3 damage to your opponent on your next turn. So next up, we have 2 copies of Searing Blaze, which is a 2 red mana instant. Searing Blaze deals 1 damage to target player and 1 damage to target creature that player controls, and it also has landfall, so if you had a land enter the battlefield under your control this turn, Searing Blaze deals 3 damage to that player and 3 damage to that creature instead. So at any point of the game after turn 2, if you play a land on your turn, you can not only deal 3 damage to your opponent's face, but you can also kill one of their creatures, which is awesome. And next up, we have 4 copies of Lava Dart, which is a 1 red mana instant. Lava Dart deals 1 damage to any target, and you can flash it back by sacrificing a mountain. Flashback means that you can cast this card from your graveyard, so if you played Lava Dart, dealt 1 damage, and you need to do it again, you can sacrifice a mountain, you can flash it back, deal 1 damage again, and then Lava Dart will go into exile. Next up, we have 1 copy of Needle Drop, which is a 1 red mana instant. Needle Drop deals 1 damage to target creature or player that was dealt damage this turn, and you get to draw a card. So similar to Skewer the Critics, you can Lightning Bolt, Lava Spike, Thermal Alchemist your opponent and deal some damage, and then you can cast Needle Drop to deal 1 more damage and draw a card. So next up, we have 4 copies of Fire Blast, which is a 6 mana instant, 2 red and 4 colorless. You may sacrifice 2 mountains rather than pay the spell's mana cost. Fire Blast deals 4 damage to any target. So I know sacrificing 2 mountains doesn't sound too great, but remember how I said you can do 18 damage by turn 3? Well, after you deal that 18 damage, even though you're tapped out, you can then sacrifice 2 mountains and kill your opponent with the Fire Blast. It's pretty sweet. And then finally, we have 4 copies of Reckless Impulse, which is a 2 mana sorcery, a red and colorless. Exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. In case you couldn't tell, Red has a really bad problem of running out of cards to cast because they just play a bunch of lightning bolts and then they're just out of cards. If they don't kill the opponent, well then shit. Reckless Impulse helps out with that because you can cast it on a turn where you're completely out of your cards. You can exile 2 lightning bolts from top of your library and finish off your opponent. And if you happen to exile 2 mountains from the top of your library, you can still play those as well, which is also a benefit because not only are you now getting your land drops, so you can use your Lava Darts and you can use your Fire Blasts, but if you didn't exile those 2 mountains from the top of your library, then that would have been 2 turns where you didn't draw anything. So whether you exile spells from top of your library or lands from top of your library, it's a win altogether. And then finally, we are running 17 basic mountains, and that's the entire deck. So now let's go ahead and talk about the sideboard, starting off with our 2 copies of Flaring Pain, which is a 2 mana instant, a red and a colorless. Damage cannot be prevented this turn and has flashback for 1 red mana. This card's fantastic because it basically counters fog decks and control decks that are playing Prismatic Strands. If your opponent casts Prismatic Strands and they're like, hey, you can't deal damage with your red cards this turn, you can cast Flaring Pain and be like, I'm gonna do it anyways. Next up, we have 4 copies of Smash to Smithereens, which is a 2 mana instant, a red and a colorless. Destroy target artifact. Smash to Smithereens deals 3 damage to that artifact's controller. If your opponent's playing a big artifact that you need to get rid of, you can blow it up and deal 3 damage to them. It's pretty sweet. Next up, we have 3 copies of Molten Rain, which is a 3 mana sorcery, 2 red and 1 colorless. Destroy target land. If that land is non-basic, Molten Rain deals 2 damage to that land's controller. Some decks in Pauper are pretty greedy about their mana base. Decks like Blue Black Terror and Tron. Molten Rain will make them hate their lives because you're blowing up their important land base and you're also dealing damage to them because you're a red player. Next up, we have 3 copies of Pyroblast, which is a 1 red mana instant, counter target spell if it's blue, or destroy target permanent if it's blue. Pyroblast is fantastic because blue players. I could say that because that's me. I'm blue players, so please, actually, don't play any Pyroblast in your deck. And then finally, we have 4 copies of End the Festivities, which is a 1 red mana sorcery that says End the Festivities deals 1 damage to each opponent and each creature and planeswalker they control. End the Festivities is our 1 red mana board wipe, so if our opponent is playing a bunch of 1/1s, End the Festivities will kill all of them. Technically speaking, there's an argument to play one of these in mainboard. You can do that. The great thing about mono red is that even though it's extremely linear, it is a bit of a toolbox deck. You can kind of mix and match however many copies of cards that you want, as long as you're killing your opponent by turn 3 or 4. So that is going to be traditional mono red burn, but now what we're gonna do is we're gonna upgrade the deck to be Kuldotha Red. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, either deck is completely viable and competitive, but despite them both being mono red, they do both have kind of different game plans. And let's talk about Kuldotha Red. Now, the way this is going to work is I'm going to show you all the cards that are in Kuldotha Red that are not in traditional burn, and then after I show you these cards, I'm going to show you what cards you would take out of traditional burn to put these cards in. So if one day you want to play traditional burn, you could take out all the Kuldotha Red pieces and put all the traditional burn pieces back in, and then when you want to go back to Kuldotha Red, you could take those traditional red pieces out and put the Kuldotha pieces back in. So let's go ahead and kick Kuldotha Red off with our namesake card, Kuldotha Rebirth, which is a 1 red mana sorcery. As additional cost to cast Kuldotha Rebirth, sacrifice an artifact, put 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens onto the battlefield. So the rest of the cards behind here are all artifact related because Kuldotha Rebirth basically wants to play a bunch of value artifact cards and then use the goblins to kill the opponent. The one and only thing I want to mention about Kuldotha Rebirth is it says as an additional cost to cast Kuldotha Rebirth, sacrifice an artifact. What this means is that when you cast Kuldotha Rebirth, you need to pick the artifact that you're going to sacrifice and sacrifice it before Kuldotha Rebirth resolves. If you're kind of in a pinch and you go to cast Kuldotha Rebirth and you want to sacrifice your Great Furnace, which is your red artifact land, which you can do, if your opponent decides they want to counter your Kuldotha Rebirth, you will still have to sacrifice your artifact land, which sucks, but that's the payment. So we're running 4 copies of Kuldotha Rebirth, and next up we have 4 copies of Goblin Blast Runner, which is a 1/2 creature for 1 red mana. Goblin Blast Runner gets +2/+0 and has menace as long as you sacrifice a permanent this turn. What menace means is that if you attack with a creature with menace, it can only be blocked by 2 or more creatures at once. If your opponent only has 1 creature out and you have a creature with menace, when you attack with that creature with menace, they can't block it because they don't have a second creature to block along with it. Goblin Blast Runner is just always going to be good in this deck because we're always sacrificing artifacts, so pretty much the entire game, he's basically just a 3/2 that's unblockable. And speaking of artifacts that are being sacrificed, we also have 4 copies of Voldaren Epicor, which is going to be a 1/1 creature for 1 red mana. When it enters a battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each opponent and create a blood token. Now, blood token is an artifact that says pay 1 mana, tap it, discard a card, sacrifice this artifact, and draw a card. Voldaren Epicor is just a body that we could put on the field, and the blood tokens are nice because we could sacrifice it to Kuldotha Rebirth. It adds artifacts to our battlefield for things like Galvanic Blast, and if we really need to, if we ran out of cards on our next turn, if we draw a card and it happens to be a land or something, we could discard it to blood token and draw a new card. So next up, we have 4 copies of Experimental Synthesizer, which is a 1 red mana artifact. When it enters or leaves the battlefield, exile a top card of your library, and then until end of turn, you may play that card. And then for 3 mana, a red and 2 colorless, you could sacrifice Experimental Synthesizer and create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with vigilance. You can only activate that ability as a sorcery. So Experimental Synthesizer is extremely good because you can pay the 1 red mana, play it, and if the top card of your library is a Kuldotha Rebirth, you can cast a Kuldotha Rebirth, sacrificing the Experimental Synthesizer, and because Experimental Synthesizer will then be leaving the battlefield, you can exile another card from the top of your library and play that card as well. So next up, we have 4 copies of Implement of Combustion, which is a 1 mana artifact. Pay 1 red mana, sacrifice it, it deals 1 damage to target player, and when it gets put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you can draw a card. So on turn 1, you could play Goblin Blast Runner, and then on turn 2, you could play Implement of Combustion, and then you could either spend a red mana to make it sacrifice itself, dealing 1 damage to the opponent, or you could play Kuldotha Rebirth, sacrificing it, you'll be able to draw a card because this is going to the graveyard, and then Goblin Blast Runner is going to get the +2/+0 and then get the menace, so you're just doing like a bunch of damage, you're getting a lot of value, you're creating creatures, it's just an overall really good card in this deck. And then next up, we're running 4 copies of Galvanic Blast, which is a 1 red mana instant. Galvanic Blast deals 2 damage to target creature or player, and it has Metalcraft, which means it will deal 4 damage to that creature or player instead if you control 3 or more artifacts. So in Kuldotha Red, we're adding a bunch of artifacts to the deck, so Galvanic Blast just becomes a really good burn spell. And then, like we talked about earlier, we are running 4 copies of Great Furnace, which is the red artifact land. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go over all the cards you're going to take out of Mono Red Burn in order to turn it into Kuldotha Red. So we have all of our copies of all the cards from Kuldotha Red that we just went over, and what we're going to take out to turn the deck into Kuldotha Red is going to be our 4 copies of Chain Lightning, 4 copies of Thermal Alchemist, 4 copies of Lava Spike, our 4 copies of Rift Bolt, our 4 copies of Skewer the Critics, our 2 copies of Searing Blaze, our 1 copy of Needle Drop. We're going to take out 1 Lava Dart, and we're going to take out 4 basic mountains for the 4 Great Furnaces. So these are all the cards you're going to take out when you're swapping between Mono Red Burn and Kuldotha Rebirth. And then of course, if you were playing Kuldotha Red and you want to swap back to Mono Red Burn, you would take out all of the Kuldotha Red cards and put all of these cards back in the deck. So that is going to be Mono Red for Pauper, both Mono Red Burn and Kuldotha Red. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. I enjoyed making it. It was kind of different than doing like 2 decks at once, but honestly, I'm not going to reorder all of those cards just for Kuldotha Red and do a separate video because technically speaking, they're pretty much all the same deck. Like I mentioned, both decks will be in the description below, and while you're down there, press subscribe button, let me know that you're enjoying the content, and let me know down in the comments below if you want to see either Mono Red Burn or Kuldotha Red in Paper Pauper playing, the series where me and my friend play Paper Pauper. And thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.